In the spring of 1885, when the Territorial Land Office opened claims in Copper Hollow, Montana, 49 settlers signed papers in the first 9 days. They took the good land, the kind you could see the value in just by standing on it. Riverbank plots with dark soil and cottonwood shade, grazing meadows where the grass already grew knee-high and the creeks ran clear through summer. Parcels near the wagon road where a family could haul supplies without burning 3 days of travel. Elspeth Brennan signed on the 10th day. She claimed a low hollow at the bottom of a dry wash called Elkhorn Creek, a sunken strip of cracked earth, 200 yards long and perhaps 60 feet wide, where floodwater rushed through every spring and left behind nothing but tangled driftwood, sand, and pale mud. The rest of the year it sat empty and baking under a sun that turned the ground the color of old bone. No one had filed on it. The land was too low to build on safely, too unpredictable to farm, too ugly to admire. The clerk at the claims office, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, looked at the map. He looked at Elspeth. He looked at the 7-year-old boy standing quietly beside her, holding the leash of a gray dog that watched everything with amber eyes. "Ma'am," the clerk said, "you understand this parcel floods every spring? The water comes down from the mountains and fills that wash bank to bank. 4 feet deep some years, 5 in a bad one." Elspeth nodded. "And you understand there's no timber on it? No grass worth grazing? The soil's mostly sand and clay, won't grow much of anything." "I understand," Elspeth said. The clerk studied her face. She was 28 years old, though the lines around her eyes made her look older. Her hands were calloused in ways that suggested she knew how to work. Her dress was worn but clean. The boy beside her had the same quiet watchfulness, the same way of standing still and observing rather than fidgeting. "Ma'am," the clerk said, lowering his voice, "I'm required to let you file on whatever parcel you choose. But I wouldn't be doing my duty if I didn't tell you this is the worst piece of ground in the county. Nobody wants it. There's a reason for that." Elspeth reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a folded piece of paper. She didn't unfold it. She just held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it against her palm. Then she set it back in her pocket. "I'm sure," she said. The clerk shrugged. He stamped her papers. He recorded her name in the ledger, and Elspeth Brennan became the legal claimant to 60 acres of flood-prone wasteland that every other settler in Copper Hollow had looked at and walked away from. Outside the land office, a group of men stood smoking and talking in the afternoon sun. Harlan Cobb was among them. He was 48 years old, thick through the shoulders, with a weathered face and the confident bearing of a man who owned 90 acres of good grassland along the North Fork. He had been in the territory for 6 years. He considered himself an authority on what the land could and could not do. He watched Elspeth come out of the office with her boy and her dog. "That the widow who just filed?" one of the men asked. "Must be," another said. Harlan Cobb shook his head slowly. He spoke loud enough for the men around him to hear, and loud enough that Elspeth heard it too as she walked past. "That woman's claiming a drainage ditch," he said. "First real flood will wash away everything she owns. First hard winter will drive her out or kill her. Mark my words." Elspeth did not stop walking. She did not turn around. She did not respond. But the boy, Tavish, looked back over his shoulder at the men. His eyes, gray like his mother's, held something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear. It was something quieter, something patient. The gray dog, Cinder, pressed against the boy's leg and kept walking. 4 months earlier, on a stretch of road 80 miles east of Copper Hollow, Elspeth had buried her husband under a cottonwood tree. Declan Brennan was 31 years old when the cholera took him. He was a carpenter from County Cork, Ireland, a quiet man with clever hands who could look at a pile of rough timber and see the house inside it, the way a sculptor sees the statue inside the stone. He had come to America at 19, worked his way west through Pennsylvania and Ohio, and met Elspeth in a boarding house in Pittsburgh where she was doing mending for pay. She was 22 then, the daughter of a Scottish brickmaker who had died of consumption 2 winters before. Her mother had passed when Elspeth was 12. She had been alone in the world for 4 years when Declan sat down across from her at the boarding house table and asked if she knew anything about the territories out west. They were married within the year. Tavish was born in the spring of 1878 in a rented room above a dry goods store in Cleveland. Declan was building cabinets for a wealthy family across town. Elspeth was taking in laundry and sewing, saving every penny they didn't absolutely need to spend. They had a plan. Out west in the new territories, settlements were spreading faster than builders could keep up. Timber was scarce in some regions. Brick was expensive to ship. A man who knew carpentry and a woman who knew brick making could build something out there. Something that would last. Something that would be theirs. It took them 7 years to save enough. 7 years of rented rooms and careful budgets and the slow accumulation of tools, supplies, knowledge. They left Cleveland in the spring of 1885, traveling with a party of 10 wagons heading for the Montana Territory. Declan drove their wagon. Elspeth kept the inventory. Little Tavish, 7 years old with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, sat between them and asked questions about everything he saw. The gray dog appeared on the third night. They had made camp beside a creek in Nebraska. Elspeth was cooking beans over the fire when she noticed the dog watching them from the edge of the firelight. It was a herding dog, the kind that worked sheep and cattle, gray as ash, with amber eyes that caught the flames and held them. It was thin, half-starved, cautious. Elspeth set a plate of beans at the edge of the camp and went back to her work. In the morning, the plate was empty and the dog was still there, lying 10 feet from the wagon with its head on its paws. "Can we keep it?" Tavish asked. Elspeth looked at Declan. Declan looked at the dog. "Seems like it's already decided," he said. Tavish named the dog Cinder because of its color. From that night forward, Cinder followed the wagon without ever being asked. It slept across the entrance of their tent. It walked beside Tavish during the day. It watched everything with those amber eyes, alert and patient, as if it understood things that humans could only guess at. The cholera struck 60 miles from Copper Hollow. It came on fast. Declan felt fine at breakfast. By noon, he was pale and sweating. By nightfall, he couldn't keep water down. 2 other men in the wagon party fell sick the same day. By the second morning, one of them was dead. Elspeth sat with Declan through 2 nights of fever. She bathed his face with water she boiled over the fire. She held his hand and talked to him about the land they were going to claim, the house they were going to build, the life they were going to make for Tavish in a place where a family could put down roots and grow. On the third morning, Declan opened his eyes. They were clear for the first time in 2 days. He looked at Elspeth. He looked at Tavish, who was sitting at the foot of the bedroll, with Cinder pressed against his side. "The dry wash," Declan said. His voice was barely a whisper. "East of the settlement. White clay. I saw it when we stopped. White clay, Elspeth." "Save your strength," Elspeth said. "We'll look at it together." But Declan shook his head. He reached for her hand and pressed something into her palm. A folded piece of paper. "You'll know what to do," he said. "You always do." He closed his eyes. By evening, he was gone. Elspeth buried him under the cottonwood tree with the help of 2 men from the wagon party. She drove his pocket knife into the bark to mark the spot. She stood there for a long time, her hand on the rough bark, while the rest of the party waited. Tavish stood beside her, silent. He had not cried since the night before. His face was pale and still, and something behind his eyes had gone quiet in a way that worried Elspeth more than tears would have. Cinder sat at the boy's feet, watching Elspeth's face. When she finally turned away, the dog pressed its head against Tavish's hand. Elspeth climbed onto the wagon. She took the reins. She kept going west. That night, in the tent they pitched at the edge of Copper Hollow while waiting for the land office to open, Elspeth unfolded the paper Declan had pressed into her hand. It was a rough sketch, lines drawn in pencil on the back of a supply list. Declan had drawn the shape of the valley, the curve of the creek, the position of the dry wash. In one corner, in his careful handwriting, he had written 3 words. White clay, Elspeth. Below that, in smaller letters, he had added something else. She will know. Elspeth stared at those words for a long time. The lantern flickered. Outside the tent, she could hear Cinder shifting position, settling in for the night. Tavish was already asleep, curled on his bedroll with one hand stretched toward the dog. Declan had seen the wash. During one of their stops, while Elspeth was cooking and Tavish was playing, Declan must have walked down into the valley. He must have seen the pale earth. He must have picked up a handful and felt the texture of it, smooth and fine. Nothing like the coarse red dirt everywhere else. He knew what she would recognize. White clay, fire clay, the kind her grandfather Angus MacLeod had worked in the Scottish Highlands for 40 years. The kind that fired hard and clean, that held its shape and heat that would crack lesser materials, that kept its pale color for 100 years. Her grandfather had taught her everything. How to read the clay by texture and color. How to judge its quality by the way it behaved when you worked it. How to shape it and fire it and turn raw earth into something that would last. Declan had known all of this. He had listened to her talk about her grandfather's workshop, about the smell of the kilns, and the feel of wet clay between her fingers, and the sound a good brick made when you tapped it. He had listened, and he had remembered. And when he saw that pale earth in the dry wash, he had known exactly what it meant. He had died before he could tell her. But he had left her the map. Elspeth folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into her pocket. She lay down beside Tavish and stared at the canvas ceiling of the tent while the wind moved through the valley outside. For the first time since she buried her husband, she let herself cry. What Declan saw in that dry wash would change everything. But first, Elspeth had to prove she was right, and that would take 3 long seasons of watching and waiting. Stay with me. Elspeth did not begin working the wash immediately. She did not build or dig or make a single brick that first year. Instead, she watched. She set up camp on the high bank above the flood line, in a spot where the ground was firm and the drainage ran away from her rather than toward her. She built a simple lean-to from salvaged poles and canvas. She staked their one remaining horse, a tired gray mare named Bonnie, on the good grass that grew along the upper bank where runoff kept the roots fed even in dry months. And then, every day, she walked the wash. She walked it in October, when the cottonwoods along the upper valley turned gold, and the air smelled of dust and dying grass. She noted the texture of the soil in the wash bed. She picked up handfuls and rubbed them between her fingers, feeling for the smoothness that meant fine grain, the slight stickiness that meant calcium content. She walked it in November, when the first snows came, and the wash filled with pale powder that melted by noon. She noted the contours of the banks, the places where erosion had carved the deepest channels, the spots where debris from past floods had accumulated. She walked it in December, in January and February, when the cold was so bitter that her breath crystallized in the air, and Cinder's paws left prints in frost that didn't melt for days. She and Tavish huddled in the lean-to, while the wind howled across the valley, burning what firewood they could scavenge, rationing the supplies they had brought from Cleveland. It was the hardest winter of Elspeth's life. There were nights when she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Nights when Tavish shivered under every blanket they owned, and Cinder pressed against them both, trying to share warmth that none of them had enough of. Nights when the wind found every gap in the canvas, and the fire burned too fast because the wood was green and wet and hard to keep lit. On those nights, she took out the paper Declan had given her. She unfolded it by candlelight and looked at his handwriting. She folded it again and kept going. The second winter was harder than the first. Elspeth tracked the snowfall on the mountains, measured the ice thickness on the creek, noted how the frozen ground cracked and heaved as temperatures dropped below zero. Tavish helped her count the days of hard freeze, learning to read the land the way his mother read it. By the third spring, Elspeth had filled 2 notebooks with observations: water levels, debris patterns, clay deposits. The wash had revealed its secrets to her, one season at a time. In March, Willa Garrett came. Willa was 34 years old, a widow herself, living alone on a small claim 2 miles up the valley. Her husband had died of a burst appendix the previous spring, leaving her with 40 acres, a small cabin, and no children. She had heard about the strange woman who had claimed the dry wash. She had heard the talk in town, the jokes, the predictions of failure. She came anyway. She brought salt pork and cornmeal. She brought a jar of honey she had traded for with a beekeeper in Millbrook. She sat in Elspeth's lean-to and looked around at the careful organization of supplies, the neatly stacked firewood, the clean cooking area. "People say you're crazy," Willa said. "I know what they say," Elspeth replied. "Are you?" Elspeth smiled for the first time in weeks. "Ask me in a year." Willa came back the next week with more supplies, and the week after that. By the end of winter, she was coming twice a week, sometimes staying overnight, helping Elspeth repair the lean-to, and teaching Tavish to read from a Bible she had brought from home. "Why are you helping us?" Elspeth asked one evening, as the first warmth of spring began to soften the frost. Willa looked out at the dry wash, still frozen and empty under the setting sun. "Because I know what it's like to have everyone tell you that you can't do something," she said. "And I know what it's like to need one person to believe you might be right." She turned back to Elspeth. "I don't know what you see in that wash, but I can see that you see something, and that's enough for me." The spring melt came in late March of 1886. Elspeth heard it before she saw it, a low, steady roar that climbed the walls of the wash and shook the ground under her bedroll. Cinder was on his feet instantly, ears forward, a low growl building in his throat. Tavish sat up, his eyes wide in the darkness. He was 8 years old now, and the year of hardship had left its mark on him. He was thinner than he should have been, but his eyes held a steadiness that many grown men lacked. "Mama?" "It's all right," Elspeth said. "This is what we've been waiting for." She pulled on her boots and her coat and stepped outside the lean-to. The night was clear, the stars sharp and cold overhead, but from the direction of the wash came a sound like 100 wagons rolling over wooden bridges. The water. By morning, the wash was transformed. Brown water ran bank to bank, churning with debris. Logs tumbled in the current, rolling and catching against each other. Branches spun in eddies near the banks. The water smelled of mud and pine and distance. The scent of high country carried down to the valley floor. Elspeth stood on the bank with Tavish beside her and Cinder at their feet. She watched the current the way her grandfather had taught her to watch it, not with impatience, not with fear, but with the quiet attention of someone cataloging what was there. She noted which sections of the wash collected the most debris. She noted where the current slowed and dropped its cargo. She noted where the water was deepest, where it was shallow, where the force of it carved new channels, and where it deposited sediment in smooth layers. She marked these spots with stakes driven into the bank. Tavish watched her work. He was thin and serious, with an expression that sometimes reminded Elspeth painfully of Declan. "What are we looking for?" he asked. Elspeth pointed at the water. "See how it carries the logs? The big ones tumble in the middle where the current is strongest. But the smaller debris, the branches and bark, they catch along the edges where the water slows down." Tavish nodded. "The clay works the same way," Elspeth continued. "The heavy particles settle first, near the center. The fine particles, the good clay, it settles last along the banks, where the water is barely moving. That's where we'll find what we need." "How do you know?" Elspeth touched the pocket where she kept Declan's map. "Your great-grandfather taught me. In Scotland, there was a river that flooded every spring, just like this one. He used to say the river was the best brickmaker's assistant he ever had. It did all the work of digging and sorting and washing the clay. All he had to do was wait and collect." Tavish looked at the churning water. For a moment, his face was thoughtful. Then he looked back at his mother. "So the flood isn't going to hurt us?" "The flood is going to feed us," Elspeth said, "if we're smart enough to let it." 3 days later, the water drained. Elspeth walked into the wash with a rope and a hand axe. The haul was enormous, 22 logs, most of them cottonwood, bleached and dried by seasons of sun before the river tore them loose. Some were 10 feet long, others 14 feet, thick as a man's thigh. The wood was sound. When Elspeth tapped the logs with the back of her axe, they rang with the solid tone of timber that had dried slowly and evenly, without rot. There were dozens of thick branches, some straight enough to serve as fence posts with minimal trimming. There were slabs of bark stripped from trees upstream, lying scattered across the mud like shed skin. There were thick mats of dried river grass, tangled and compressed, sitting in long rows where the current had deposited them. And there was clay, fresh, smooth, pale clay, deposited across the wash bed in a layer 4 inches deep in places. Still wet, still workable. When Elspeth picked up a handful and pressed it slowly between her thumb and forefinger, it held together without crumbling. It stretched without tearing. It had a faint mineral smell, clean and sharp, that meant calcium content and firing strength. She had found it. Elspeth stood in the middle of the wash with that handful of clay and looked up at the sky. For a moment, she could almost see her grandfather's face. She could almost hear his voice, thick with the accent of the Highlands. White clay fires hard and true, lass. It holds its shape when the red clay cracks. It keeps its color when the red clay darkens. Find white clay and you found gold. She looked down at her hands, at the pale earth clinging to her fingers. Thank you, she whispered. She wasn't sure if she was talking to her grandfather, or to Declan, or to the river itself. It didn't matter. Someone had left her this gift, and she was going to use it. Elspeth spent the next 3 weeks processing what the flood had delivered. The straight logs she trimmed with the draw knife Declan had carried from Cleveland, squaring the ends and shaving the bark. She tested each one for soundness, tapping with a mallet and listening for the dull thud that meant rot inside. Most were solid. The best pieces she marked with charcoal and set aside as beams. The rest she cut to fence post length, 7 feet, and stacked them upright in racks to dry. The twisted and knotted pieces she split with a wedge and sledgehammer into firewood and kindling, stacking them in cord-length rows under a brush shelter to keep the rain off. The bark and river grass she bundled with twine, pressing them tight and letting them dry. Bark made good packing material. Settlers used it to insulate cabin walls and line root cellars. River grass made insulation too, stuffed between wallboards or layered under roofing. Both were things people needed and didn't want to spend time gathering themselves. Then she turned to the clay. She dug it from the wash bed with a flat shovel, loading it into buckets and hauling it to her work area on the bank. The muscles in her arms and back screamed with exhaustion by the end of each day. Her hands cracked and bled. But she kept working. She added water from the creek. She mixed the clay with her hands until it reached the consistency her grandfather had taught her. Wet enough to hold together. Dry enough not to slump. She had brought 3 things from Cleveland that mattered more than anything else she owned. Her grandfather's wooden brick molds, carved from Scottish oak, each the size of a loaf of bread, open at the top and bottom so the clay could be pressed in and turned out clean. Her grandfather's notes, written in his cramped handwriting, describing temperatures and timing, and the 100 small details that meant the difference between good bricks and broken ones. And the knowledge in her hands, trained over 10 years of watching and doing, that no book could fully capture. She pressed the clay into the molds. She leveled the tops with a straight stick. She turned the bricks out onto flat ground to dry. The sun did the rest. In 4 days of Montana heat, the bricks dried hard and pale, almost white. When Elspeth tapped them together, they rang with a clean, sharp sound. The sound of density, the sound of strength. Against the red-brown dust of everything else in the territory, they looked like they came from a different country entirely. Tavish helped. He was small for his age but determined. He carried buckets of water from the creek. He helped stack the dried bricks. He learned to recognize the sound of a good brick versus a flawed one. "This one's bad," he said one afternoon, holding up a brick that looked identical to the others. Elspeth took it from him and tapped it. The sound was slightly flat, slightly dull. "How did you know?" she asked. Tavish pointed at a hairline crack running along one edge. "I saw it when I picked it up, and it felt different, lighter." Elspeth smiled. It was the first time she had really smiled since Declan died. "Good eye," she said. "Throw it in the discard pile. We only sell the perfect ones." By midsummer, she had 500 bricks drying in rows across the bank. From a distance, they looked like a field of pale teeth rising from the dark earth. She had 80 fence posts standing in racks. She had 12 squared beams. She had 9 cords of firewood and 40 bundles of bark and grass. She hadn't spent a cent on materials. The river had delivered all of it. 500 bricks, 80 fence posts, 9 cords of firewood, all from a wash that nobody wanted. But Elspeth knew this was only the beginning. The real test was coming. Would anyone buy what she had made? Stay with me. Harlan Cobb came in August. He rode up to Elspeth's camp on a hot afternoon, his hat in his hands, his horse dark with sweat. He was the same man who had stood outside the land office and declared that she was claiming a drainage ditch. The same man who had predicted the flood would wash away everything she owned. He looked at the rows of pale bricks gleaming in the sun. He looked at the stacks of fence posts, cut and trimmed and ready for sale. He looked at the small cabin that Elspeth had started building on the high bank, its walls rising slowly in courses of pale brick. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he cleared his throat. "I need fence posts," he said. 60 of them. I'm expanding the corral, and my supplier in Millbrook can't deliver for 3 weeks. Elspeth wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to the post racks. She pulled one out and held it up for him to see. 7 feet of straight cottonwood, the bark stripped, the ends squared and slightly charred to prevent rot. 60 cents each, she said. You haul them yourself. Harlan's eyes narrowed. Millbrook charges $1.25. Millbrook is 3 days by wagon. I'm here. Harlan looked at the post in her hands. He reached out and took it, hefting it, testing the weight. He ran his thumb along the grain. He tapped one end against a rock and listened to the sound. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of respect. 60 posts, he said. I'll be back tomorrow with my wagon. He turned to go. Then he stopped. These posts, he said, not quite looking at her. They're sound. Better than what I expected. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to one that Harlan Cobb had ever given anyone. Elspeth watched him right away. Tavish came to stand beside her, Cinder at his heels. He was mean to you before, Tavish said. At the land office. I remember. I remember too. Why did you sell to him? Elspeth put her hand on her son's shoulder. Because his money spends the same as anyone else's, she said, and because proving him wrong matters more than holding a grudge. She looked out at the wash, where the afternoon sun was turning the pale clay the color of cream. Let them laugh, she said. We have work to do. Silas Drummond came 2 weeks after Harlan Cobb. He was 67 years old, bent at the shoulders from decades of working over an anvil, with hands like leather and eyes that had seen everything the territory could throw at a man. He had been the blacksmith in Copper Hollow for 30 years, longer than most of the current settlers had been alive. He didn't come to buy fence posts. He came because he had heard something, and he needed to see it for himself. Elspeth was working at the mixing area when she saw him walking down from the road. He moved slowly, favoring his left hip, but his eyes were sharp and alert. He stopped at the edge of the brick drying field and stood there for a long moment, looking. Then he walked into the field. He bent down, his knees creaking, and picked up one of the pale bricks. He turned it over in his hands. He held it up to the light. He ran his calloused thumb across the surface. Then he did something that made Elspeth hold her breath. He tapped the brick against another one, exactly the way she did, and he listened. His face changed. The skepticism drained out of it, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. Fire clay, he said. His voice was rough, but there was a note of reverence in it. I haven't seen fire clay in 30 years, not since I left Pennsylvania. Elspeth walked over to where he was standing. You know fire clay? Know it? Silas laughed, a dry sound like old paper rustling. I grew up with it. My father was a potter before he was a smith. Made stoneware for half of Lancaster County. Used to say that white clay was worth its weight in silver because it held up when everything else fell apart. He looked at Elspeth with new eyes. Where did you learn to work it? My grandfather, in Scotland. He made bricks for 40 years. Silas nodded slowly. He set the brick back down on the drying ground, but his hand lingered on it for a moment, almost affectionately. I need a new chimney for my forge, he said. The old one's cracking. Every time I run the fire hot, I lose more mortar. I've been using red bricks from Whitfield's yard in Millbrook, but they don't hold up. 3 years, maybe 4, and I have to rebuild. He looked at the rows of pale bricks stretching across the bank. How many can you make by October? How many do you need? 600, maybe 800 if you can manage it. Elspeth did the math in her head. She had 500 bricks dried and ready. The next flood wouldn't come until spring, but she had stockpiled enough clay to make another 300 if she worked hard through September. I can give you 600 by the end of October, she said. 800 if you can wait until November. I'll take all 800. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. What's your price? Elspeth had been thinking about this ever since the first bricks came out of the molds. Whitfield's red bricks sold for 4 cents each plus freight. She could undercut him easily, but she didn't want to start a price war she couldn't win. And she knew from her grandfather's teachings that white clay was worth more than red. 5 cents each, she said. No freight charge if you haul them yourself. Silas nodded. Fair. He counted out coins and pressed them into her hand. Half now. half on delivery, $20. More money than Elspeth had seen in one place since leaving Cleveland. Silas turned to go, then stopped. He looked back at the wash, at the pale clay gleaming in the late afternoon sun. You know, he said, when I heard about the widow who claimed the dry wash, I figured you were either crazy or desperate. Maybe both. Elspeth waited. Now I'm thinking maybe you're the smartest person in this valley. He shook his head slowly. Fire clay, right here under everyone's noses, and nobody saw it but you. He walked away, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The news about Silas Drummond's order spread through Copper Hollow like fire through dry grass. Within 2 weeks, everyone in the territory knew that the old blacksmith had commissioned 800 bricks from the widow in the wash. And not just any bricks, white bricks, fire clay. Most people were curious. Some were skeptical. One man was furious. Cornelius Whitfield owned the only brickworks within 60 miles. His yard in Millbrook had been producing red clay bricks for 8 years, supplying construction projects across 5 counties. He had built churches and courthouses, storefronts and warehouses. He had made himself wealthy on the back of his monopoly, and he had grown comfortable in the assumption that no one would ever challenge it. When he heard about the widow's white bricks, he laughed. When he heard about Silas Drummond's order, he stopped laughing. When he heard that Harlan Cobb, one of his regular customers, had bought 60 fence posts from the same woman, he got in his wagon and rode to Copper Hollow himself. Elspeth was working the clay when she saw him coming. A big man in a fine coat, driving a wagon with Whitfield Brickworks, Millbrook, painted on the side in gold letters. He pulled up at the edge of her property and sat there for a moment, looking around with the expression of someone surveying land they intended to buy. Then he climbed down and walked toward her. "Mrs. Brennan, is it?" Elspeth straightened up. Her hands were covered in pale clay. Her dress was streaked with dust. She pushed a strand of hair out of her face and met his eyes. "That's right." Whitfield picked up one of the dried bricks from the nearest row. He turned it over, examining it the way Silas had. But where Silas's face had shown wonder, Whitfield showed only contempt. "White clay," he said. "Soft, chalky. It'll crumble inside a year." Silas Drummond doesn't think so. Silas Drummond is a sentimental old fool who remembers his father's pottery and thinks that means he knows anything about construction materials. Whitfield set the brick down harder than necessary. A chip broke off one corner. "My red bricks built half this territory, Mrs. Brennan. Every major structure from here to Helena has Whitfield bricks in its foundation. You think you can compete with that? With a wash full of river mud and a handful of wooden molds?" Elspeth said nothing. She had learned from her grandfather that there was no point arguing with men who had already made up their minds. You didn't convince them with words. You showed them. Whitfield's eyes narrowed. He was not used to being met with silence. He was used to people agreeing with him, or at least pretending to. "I'll give you fair warning," he said. "This territory has room for one brick supplier. That's me. If you try to take my customers, you'll regret it." He turned and walked back to his wagon. At the edge of the property, he stopped and looked back. "White clay," he said again, shaking his head. "Soft as chalk." He drove away. Tavish came out from behind the lean-to, where he had been watching. Cinder was at his side, hackles raised, a low growl still rumbling in his throat. "He was mean," Tavish said. "Meaner than the other man." "Yes," Elspeth agreed. "He was. Is he going to try to hurt us?" Elspeth looked at her son. He was 9 years old now, thin and serious and watchful. He had seen his father die. He had survived winters that nearly killed them both. He was not a child who could be protected by easy lies. "Maybe," she said, "but we're not going to let him." She picked up the brick that Whitfield had chipped and examined the damage. A corner was broken, nothing more. The body of the brick was still sound. She set it back down with the others. "We have work to do," she said. The rumors started 2 weeks later. At first, they were whispers. Conversations that stopped when Elspeth walked into the general store. Glances exchanged between neighbors when her name was mentioned. Then the whispers became words. "The white bricks are poisonous. The clay comes from a bad place, upstream from where the cattle died last spring. Anyone who uses them in their home will get sick. The widow uses strange methods, foreign methods. Her grandfather was some kind of witch in Scotland, mixing potions into the clay. The bricks will crumble. Mark my words. One hard winter, and they'll fall apart like wet sand. Elspeth heard all of it. She said nothing. She kept working. But the damage was real. 3 customers who had expressed interest in ordering bricks came back and said they had changed their minds. A merchant in Ridgemont who had planned to use white bricks for his new storefront suddenly decided to stay with Whitfield's red clay. Jebediah Tull, a young man of 25 who had bet $5 that the flood would wash Elspeth out, went around the saloon telling everyone that he was going to win his bet after all. Elspeth knew who was behind it. Whitfield had the resources, the connections, and the motivation. What she didn't know was how to fight back. Then Reverend Ezekiel Moss came to visit. He was 55 years old, thin and stern-faced, with the bearing of a man who believed he spoke for God and expected others to listen. He had been the minister of Copper Hollow's only church for 12 years. His opinion carried weight. When he spoke, people paid attention. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, riding a gray mule that was almost as thin and stern as he was. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, not dismounting, "I've heard troubling things about your operation here." Elspeth set down her shovel. "What kind of things?" "Strange methods, foreign methods. Some people say your grandfather practiced the old ways. The kind of ways that don't sit well with Christian folk." Elspeth felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice steady. "My grandfather was a Presbyterian, Reverend. He read his Bible every night and went to kirk every Sunday. The only thing he practiced was brick-making, which he learned from his father, who learned it from his father before him. There's nothing strange or foreign about hard work and good clay." The Reverend's eyes narrowed. He looked at the rows of pale bricks, at the cabin rising on the bank, at Tavish sitting nearby with Cinder at his side. "I'd like to see how you make them," he said. "If you have nothing to hide, you won't mind showing me?" It was not a request. Elspeth could have refused. She could have told him to mind his own business and get off her property. But she knew that would only feed the rumors. It would only give Whitfield more ammunition. Instead, she smiled. "Of course, Reverend. I'd be happy to show you everything. Would you like to start now?" The Reverend dismounted. For the next 3 hours, Elspeth walked him through every step of her process. She showed him the clay beds in the wash. She let him feel the texture of the raw material. She demonstrated how she mixed it with water, how she pressed it into the molds, how she leveled the tops and turned the bricks out to dry. She had Tavish tap 2 bricks together and describe what he heard. She broke open a brick that had been damaged in drying and showed him the consistent color all the way through, the absence of impurities or foreign matter. By the end of the tour, the Reverend's face had changed. The suspicion was still there, but it was mixed with something else. Grudging respect, maybe, or at least the recognition that whatever Elspeth was doing, there was nothing sinister about it. "I see nothing here but honest labor," he said finally. "That's because there's nothing else to see." The Reverend mounted his mule. He looked down at Elspeth for a long moment. "I'll tell people what I saw," he said. "It won't stop all the talk, but it might help." He rode away. The following Sunday, Reverend Moss stood before his congregation and said, "I have visited the widow Brennan's claim. I have seen her work with my own eyes. There is nothing there but clean clay and honest hands. Anyone who says otherwise is bearing false witness." The rumors didn't stop entirely, but they faded, and the customers started coming back. The rumors had faded. The customers were returning, but Cornelius Whitfield was watching from Millbrook, and he was not a man who accepted defeat easily. What he planned next would test everything Elspeth had built. Stay with me. 3 years passed. Silas Drummond's forged chimney stood solid through 3 winters, with not a single crack in the pale bricks that lined it. He ran his fire 14 hours a day at temperatures that would have split red clay inside a week, and the white bricks held true. Word spread. A blacksmith in Ridgemont ordered 500 bricks for his own forge. A merchant in Harper's Crossing used white bricks for the front wall of his new general store, and the pale face of it stood out against the dusty street like a clean shirt in a crowd of dirty ones. People started calling them Brennan Whites. Elspeth built her operation slowly, carefully, the way her grandfather had taught her. She constructed proper drying racks, standing frames where bricks could cure evenly in the air. She built covered drying beds, roofed with salvaged bark to keep the rain off while letting the heat through. She finished her cabin on the high bank, its walls rising 12 feet above the flood line, built from her own pale bricks and roofed with her own driftwood beams. Each spring, the flood came. Each spring, it replenished her supplies. The second flood was bigger than the first. It brought 28 logs, a wall of branches, and a clay deposit 6 inches deep across the widest part of the wash. Elspeth processed it all. The third flood was smaller, but brought unusually straight timber. She got 40 fence posts out of it and beams long enough to span doorways. While other settlers struggled for raw materials, riding 3 days to the mill, cutting timber in the mountains, digging clay from pits that flooded unpredictably, Elspeth simply waited. The river did the work. She collected and processed what it gave her. Tavish grew. At 9, he could grade timber by sound alone, tapping logs with a mallet and listening for the ring of solid wood versus the dull thud of rot. At 10, he could judge clay quality by texture. At 11, he was helping mix and mold, his hands learning the same motions that Elspeth had learned from her grandfather. Cinder grew older. His muzzle turned gray. His steps slowed. But every night he slept on the porch of the pale brick cabin, and every morning he followed Tavish down to the wash, watching over the boy the way he had watched over the family since that night in Nebraska. Willa Garrett came often, sometimes to help, sometimes just to sit and talk. She and Elspeth became friends in the way that women on the frontier became friends, bonded by shared hardship and mutual respect, and the knowledge that in this hard country, you needed people you could count on. And through it all, Cornelius Whitfield watched. He watched his market share decline. He watched customers who had bought from him for years switch to Brennan White's. He watched the pale bricks appear on buildings across the territory, clean and bright against the dusty brown and red of everything else. He was patient. He was waiting for his opportunity. In the spring of 1889, he found it. The winter of 1888 to 89 was the hardest anyone could remember. Snow fell in November and didn't stop. By January, drifts covered the first-floor windows of cabins throughout the valley. Cattle froze in the fields. Roads became impassable. 3 settlers died of exposure, including an old man who went out to check on his horses and never came back. Elspeth watched the snow pile up on the mountains above the valley. She measured the depth. She counted the days since the last melt. "It's going to be bad," she told Tavish one evening as they sat by the fire in the pale brick cabin. "Worse than anything we've seen." The flood? The biggest one in years, maybe the biggest ever. She had been preparing all winter, moving finished bricks to higher ground, reinforcing the drying racks, building a secondary storage area on the hillside above the wash. But she couldn't move everything. The flood came on April 15th. It came at night, as floods often did, a low roar that built and built until it shook the walls of the cabin. Cinder was on his feet instantly, barking at the door. Tavish sat up in his bed, his face pale in the darkness. He was 11 years old now, tall for his age, with Declan's dark hair and the watchful eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. "It's here," Elspeth said. By dawn, the wash was unrecognizable. Water roared through the channel at 8 feet deep, higher than any flood Elspeth had ever seen. It overtopped the banks in 3 places. It tore away the lower drying racks as if they were made of paper. It swept 800 bricks, carefully shaped and dried and ready for sale, into the churning current and carried them away downstream. Elspeth stood on the high bank and watched everything she had built for the past 4 years being destroyed. Tavish stood beside her. He had not cried since his father died. He did not cry now, but his hand found hers and held it tight. "Mama," he said quietly, "we lost everything." Elspeth watched the water roar past. Her chest felt hollow. 4 years of work. 4 years of proving herself. 4 years of building something that was supposed to last. Gone in one night. But as the sun rose higher and the initial shock began to fade, Elspeth made herself look again. She made herself look at what the flood had left, not just what it had taken. The cabin still stood. Built on the highest point of the bank, 12 feet above the normal flood line, it had stayed dry. The secondary storage area on the hillside was untouched. 200 bricks and 30 fence posts, safe and sound. And the wash itself. The wash was transformed. As the water began to recede, Elspeth could see what it had deposited. Logs. More logs than she had ever seen in one place. Dozens of them. Massive cottonwoods and pines torn from the mountains and delivered to her doorstep. They lay jammed against each other, spanning the width of the wash. And beneath them, around them, covering everything. Clay. White clay. A layer 8 inches deep in places. Smooth and fine and pale as cream. More raw material than 3 normal floods would have brought. Tavish looked at his mother. He saw something change in her face. The despair was still there, but something else was rising beside it. Something that looked almost like hope. "Mama?" Elspeth walked down the bank to the edge of the receding water. She knelt and scooped up a handful of the fresh clay. She watched how it held together, how it stretched, how it felt against her skin. It was perfect, the best clay she had ever worked. She looked up at Tavish. "We didn't lose everything," she said. "We lost what we made, but the river just gave us more than we've ever had to make it again. But, but it took 4 years. Then we work harder, we work faster, we work longer." Elspeth stood and looked at the wash, at the bounty of timber and clay spread before her. "The river took what we built, but it also gave us the tools to build again. That's what it's always done. That's what it always will do." She turned to face her son. "Are you with me?" Tavish looked at the devastation. He looked at the raw materials. He looked at his mother, covered in mud and exhausted and standing straighter than she had any right to stand. "I'm with you," he said. Elspeth smiled. It was a tired smile, but it was real. "Then let's get to work." News of the great flood spread quickly through the valley. Most people shook their heads and said what they had always said, that the widow had been foolish to claim floodland, that she had been lucky to survive this long, that surely now she would give up and move on to something more sensible. One person said something different. Jebediah Tull was 25 years old. He had been in Copper Hollow for 3 years, working odd jobs and drinking more than he should. He was the man who had bet $5 that the flood would wash Elspeth out. He was the man who had laughed loudest when people called her crazy. He was also the man who had watched her, year after year, proving everyone wrong. He rode up to her claim 2 days after the flood, when Elspeth and Tavish were already hip-deep in the wash, hauling logs out of the mud. "Mrs. Brennan," he said. Elspeth straightened up. She was covered in clay from head to foot. Her arms ached, her back screamed. She had slept 4 hours in the past 2 days. "Mr. Tull." Jebediah looked at the devastation. He looked at the raw materials. He looked at the woman and the boy, working side by side in the mud, refusing to quit. "I heard what happened," he said. "Everyone heard. I bet against you, 3 years ago, bet $5 you'd be gone by spring." "I know." Jebediah shifted in his saddle. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, almost humble. "I was wrong." Elspeth waited. "I was wrong about you," Jebediah continued, "about what you were doing here, about whether you could make it work. I was wrong about all of it." He swung down from his horse and stood at the edge of the wash. "I don't have much," he said, "but I've got 2 hands and a strong back. I can work, and I'm tired of—" He trailed off, looking at the ground. "I'm tired of being the kind of man who bets against people." Elspeth studied him. She saw a young man who had wasted years of his life. She also saw something else, something in his eyes that looked like the beginning of something better. "You'd work for me? For food and a place to sleep, until you're back on your feet. After that," he shrugged, "we can talk about wages." Elspeth looked at Tavish. Her son was watching Jebediah with careful, assessing eyes. "He means it," Tavish said quietly. "I can tell." Elspeth turned back to Jebediah. "There's a lean-to behind the cabin," she said. "It's dry and out of the wind. Breakfast is at dawn, supper is at dusk. In between, we work." "Yes, ma'am." "And Jebediah?" "Yes." "That $5 you bet against me?" Jebediah flushed. "You can keep it," Elspeth said. "Consider it a reminder of who you used to be, and motivation to become someone different." She turned back to the wash and the work waiting for her. After a moment, Jebediah tied his horse to a post and waded into the mud beside her. 8 months after the flood, Elspeth's operation was larger than it had ever been. With Jebediah's help, She had processed all the timber the flood had brought. She had made 1,500 bricks, more than she had produced in any previous year. She had expanded the drying beds, reinforced the storage areas, built a proper workshop with a roof and walls. Tavish was 12 now, old enough to understand the business, old enough to take pride in what they were building together. Brennan White's appeared on 4 new buildings across the territory. The pale face of the church in Harper's Crossing, visible from 2 miles out, became a landmark that travelers used to orient themselves. Merchants specifically requested white bricks for their storefronts, knowing that the clean, bright color made their businesses look prosperous and modern. Cornelius Whitfield watched his market share continue to decline. He watched his dreams of monopoly crumble. He watched a widow and her son accomplish what he had always believed impossible, and he made his move. The letter arrived in October. Tavish was 13 now, old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to feel the weight of it. It was delivered by a lawyer from Helena, a thin man with cold eyes and an expensive suit. He handed it to Elspeth without ceremony and stood waiting while she read it. The letter was from the Territorial Land Office. It stated that a review of homestead claims had revealed a discrepancy in Elspeth's filing. Her name had been recorded incorrectly. The document said Brennan instead of Brennan. Due to this error, the letter continued, the claim was technically invalid. A new filing would need to be made. In the meantime, the land was legally unclaimed, and a Mr. Cornelius Whitfield had expressed interest in purchasing it at the standard rate. Elspeth read the letter twice. Her hands were steady, but inside she felt like the ground had dropped out from under her. "Is this legal?" she asked. The lawyer smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "The law is quite clear on clerical errors, Mrs. Brennan, or Mrs. Brennan, as the case may be. If the name on the claim does not match the name of the claim is invalid. You have 60 days to prove that the error was made by the land office and not by yourself. If you cannot prove this, the land reverts to territorial control and becomes available for purchase." "I didn't make the error. I spelled my name correctly." "Can you prove that?" Elspeth thought of the day she had signed the papers, the clerk with the ink-stained fingers, the way he had written while she watched, but she hadn't thought to check every letter. I don't know." The lawyer tipped his hat. 60 days, Mrs. Brennan. I suggest you find a good lawyer." He walked away. Elspeth stood in the doorway of her cabin, the letter clutched in her hand, and felt her world tilting toward disaster. Everything Elspeth had built hung by a thread. A single misspelled letter could take it all away. But she wasn't alone anymore. And the truth has a way of coming to light. Stay with me. The news spread through Copper Hollow like wildfire. Some people shook their heads and said it was a shame. Some said they had always known something like this would happen. Some said nothing at all, just watched and waited to see what would come next. But some people did more than watch. Harlan Cobb was the first to arrive. He rode up to Elspeth's cabin 3 days after the lawyer's visit, his hat in his hands, his face grim. "I heard what Whitfield's trying to do," he said. "It's not right." Elspeth looked at him. This was the man who had called her crazy 5 years ago, the man who had predicted she would fail, the man who had become one of her best customers. "No," she agreed, "it's not." "You need witnesses," Harlan said. "People who can testify that you've been here, working this land for 5 years, that you're Elspeth Brennan, same as you always were, no matter what some fool clerk wrote down. And you'd be willing to testify." Harlan met her eyes. "Ma'am, I owe you more than that. You proved me wrong, and you did it with grace. You never threw it in my face. You just kept working." He put his hat back on. "I'll testify, and I'll round up others who will too." Silas Drummond came the next day, then Willa Garrett, then Reverend Moss, who had once suspected her of witchcraft and now stood ready to vouch for her character in any court in the territory. By the end of the week, Elspeth had 15 people willing to sign affidavits confirming her identity and her continuous occupation of the land. Merchants who had bought her bricks, neighbors who had watched her work, even Deputy Marshal Obadiah Vance, who had once thought her foolish, now believed her honest. But affidavits weren't enough. "The law is the law," the territorial judge told her when she filed her response to Whitfield's claim. "Character witnesses can support your case, but they can't prove that the clerk made the error. You need documentation. What kind of documentation? Something that shows your legal name was Brennan before you ever arrived in Copper Hollow. A marriage certificate, a birth record, something official. Elspeth thought of the trunk where she kept her important papers. The marriage certificate was there. She had looked at it 100 times since Declan died. It said Elspeth MacLeod Brennan in clear black ink. But would that be enough? The judge had seemed skeptical. Whitfield's lawyer was expensive and experienced, and she had only 60 days. The night before the hearing, Tavish found it. He was looking for the marriage certificate in the trunk, checking one more time to make sure it was ready for the morning. Elspeth had already gone to bed, exhausted from weeks of worry and preparation. The trunk was full of memories. Declan's pocket knife, his carpenter's tools, the wooden brick molds that had come all the way from Scotland, and beneath everything else, a bundle of letters tied with string. Tavish hesitated. He had never looked through his parents' correspondence. It felt like an intrusion into something private and sacred. But something made him untie the string. Most of the letters were what he expected. Notes from Declan to Elspeth during their courtship. Business correspondence from the years in Cleveland. A letter from Elspeth's aunt in Scotland, dated years before Tavish was born. And then, at the bottom of the stack, an envelope he had never seen before. It was addressed to the Territorial Land Office in Helena. The return address was a town in Nebraska, near where Declan had died, and the date on the postmark was 3 weeks before they arrived in Copper Hollow. Tavish opened it. Inside was a letter, written in his father's careful handwriting. To the Territorial Land Office of Montana, it read, I am writing to confirm that my wife, Elspeth MacLeod Brennan, will be filing a claim on land in the Copper Hollow region upon our arrival. I wish to be recorded as co-claimant with full rights of survivorship to either party. Please note the correct spelling of our family name, Brennan. At the bottom, Declan had signed his name and had the signature witnessed by a notary public in Nebraska. He had written this letter before he died. He had mailed it before the cholera struck, and somehow it had never reached its destination. It had been returned to sender to an address they had already left, and eventually forwarded to them in Copper Hollow, but no one had ever opened it. It had arrived while Elspeth was working in the wash, and Tavish, then only 8 years old, had tucked it into the trunk with the other papers and forgotten about it. Until now. Elspeth stared at the letter in the lamplight, her hands trembling. He sent this before he died, she whispered. He knew something might go wrong, and he tried to protect us. Tavish sat beside her on the bed. He was nearly as tall as his mother now, with his father's dark hair and his father's quiet determination. Will it work? He asked. Will the judge accept it? Elspeth looked at the signature, at the notary's seal, at the date, weeks before the contested filing. It proves that our name is Brennan, she said. It proves that Declan intended to file alongside me, and it proves that the error was made by the land office, not by us. She looked at her son. Your father is still protecting us, even now. The hearing took place in the Territorial Courthouse in Helena, a 2-day ride from Copper Hollow. Cornelius Whitfield was there, sitting with his lawyer, looking confident. He had spent weeks preparing his case. He had documents and witnesses and legal precedents on his side. What he didn't have was Declan's letter. Elspeth presented her evidence calmly and clearly. The marriage certificate, the affidavits from 15 witnesses, and finally the letter that Declan had written 2 weeks before his death, confirming the correct spelling of their name and his intention to file as co-claimant. Whitfield's lawyer objected. He called the letter suspicious. He questioned its authenticity. He demanded to know why it had never been presented before. The judge examined the letter carefully. He studied the notary's seal. He compared the signature to the one on the marriage certificate. Then he looked at Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, he said, did you or anyone working on your behalf have any involvement in the original clerical error that recorded Mrs. Brennan's name incorrectly? Whitfield's face went pale. I don't know what you mean. The clerk who processed Mrs. Brennan's claim no longer works at the land office. He left 3 months after filing her papers. Do you know where he went? Whitfield said nothing. Because I have a statement from him, the judge continued. He's currently working at your brickyard in Millbrook, and he remembers very clearly that he was asked to make a small error in a specific filing in exchange for future employment. The courtroom went silent. "This hearing is concluded," the judge said. "Mrs. Brennan's claim is valid. The land belongs to her, as it always has. Mr. Whitfield, I suggest you consult with your lawyer about the penalties for fraud and conspiracy." Elspeth closed her eyes. When she opened them again, Cornelius Whitfield was leaving the courtroom. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. He walked out into the Montana sun, and within a year his brickworks in Millbrook would close. Within 2 years he would leave the territory entirely, his reputation ruined, his business destroyed, not by competition, not by market forces, by the truth. The years that followed were the best years of Elspeth's life. With the legal threat removed, she poured her energy into building, not just bricks and buildings, but something larger, a reputation, a legacy, a name that would outlast her. By 1894, Brennan whites were used in construction projects across 5 counties. The pale bricks appeared on the fronts of general stores and the faces of churches, on forged chimneys that burned hot for decades without cracking, and on home hearths that warmed families through the harshest winters. Builders requested them by name. Architects from as far away as Helena specifically wrote Brennan white fireclay brick into their specifications. A surveyor passing through the territory noted in his report that the distinctive pale bricks had become a mark of quality and permanence throughout the region. Elspeth expanded her operation carefully, the way her grandfather had taught her. She hired workers, trained them in her methods, and paid them fairly. Jebediah Tull, who had once bet against her, became her foreman. 2 young men from town joined the crew. A woman named Ruth Ashford, another widow who had lost her husband to a mining accident, came to learn brickmaking and eventually started her own small operation 50 miles north. Elspeth helped her build her first kiln. The cabin on the high bank became a proper house with 3 rooms and a stone foundation and a porch that looked out over the wash. Cinder, old and gray now, spent his days sleeping in the sun on that porch, watching the workers move through the yard with the same amber eyes that had watched over the Brennan family since that night in Nebraska. Tavish grew into a young man. At 16, he could grade timber and clay as well as his mother. At 18, he was teaching the new workers the techniques that Elspeth had taught him, the techniques that Angus MacLeod had taught her in Scotland half a century before. The knowledge was moving forward, generation to generation, hand to hand, like water through a wash. In the spring of 1897, 12 years after Elspeth filed her claim on the dry wash, Harlan Cobb came to visit. He was older now, his hair more gray than brown, his steps slower than it had been. But his eyes were the same, and the look in them, as he stood at the edge of the wash and surveyed everything Elspeth had built, was not the contempt he had shown 12 years before. It was respect. "I owe you something," he said. Elspeth set down the brick she was holding and wiped her hands on her apron. "You've paid for everything you've bought," she said. "We're square." "Not that kind of debt." Harlan removed his hat and held it in his hands. "I stood outside the land office 12 years ago and called you crazy. Said the flood would wash you out. Said you'd never make it. I remember. I was wrong." He looked at the rows of pale bricks, at the workers moving through the yard, at the house on the high bank with smoke curling from its pale chimney. "I was wrong about everything." Elspeth studied his face. She saw the years written there, the hard lessons learned. "You testified for me at the hearing. You helped save my land." "That was the least I could do." Harlan put his hat back on. "But I wanted to say it out loud. I was wrong about you, and I'm sorry it took me 12 years to admit it." Elspeth smiled. It was a warm smile without bitterness or triumph. "Apology accepted." Harlan nodded. He started to turn away, then stopped. "My daughter," he said. "Patience. She's 14, smart girl, curious. She's been asking questions about how you make those bricks, about why they're different from the red ones, about how you knew this land would give you what you needed." Elspeth waited. "Would you teach her?" Harlan asked. "The way your grandfather taught you?" Elspeth looked past him, toward the wash where the afternoon sun was turning the clay the color of cream. Somewhere in the yard she could hear Tavish's voice, explaining something to one of the workers, the sound of knowledge being passed on. "Send her tomorrow," she said. "Bring shoes she doesn't mind getting muddy." Patience Cobb arrived the next morning at dawn. She was tall for 14, with her father's square jaw and her mother's careful eyes. She stood at the edge of the wash and looked at everything, the drying racks and the mixing areas, and the rows of pale bricks stretching across the bank. "Where do we start?" she asked. Elspeth handed her a bucket and a shovel. "At the beginning." For the next 3 months, Patience came every day. She learned to read clay by texture and color and the way it behaved when you worked it. She learned to grade timber by sound, tapping logs and listening for the ring of solid wood. She learned to shape bricks in the wooden molds and level them with a straight stick and turn them out to dry. She asked questions constantly. Why does white clay fire harder than red? Why does the river bring different materials each year? Why did everyone think this land was worthless when it turned out to be valuable? Elspeth answered every question patiently, the way Angus had answered her questions 40 years before. But the last question, Patience asked on her own. "How did you know?" the girl said one afternoon, as they sat on the bank watching the bricks dry in the summer sun. "How did you know this wash would give you everything you needed?" Elspeth knelt and scooped up a handful of pale clay. She pressed it slowly between her thumb and forefinger, watching how it held its shape, the way Angus had shown her when she was Patience's age. "I didn't know," she said. "I watched. I waited. And I trusted what my grandfather taught me, even though he wasn't there to see it." She set the clay down and looked at Patience. "That's what knowledge is. Not certainty, not guarantees, just patterns. Things that people before you noticed and remembered and passed on. You learn the patterns and then you watch for them. And when you see them, you trust them." Patience was quiet for a moment. "My father thought you were crazy," she said. "I know. He doesn't anymore. I know that too." "What changed his mind?" Elspeth smiled. "Time. Results. The fact that the pale bricks on his forge chimney haven't cracked in 8 years, even though he runs his fire hot enough to melt iron." She looked out at the wash. "People believe what they see, so you show them, and you keep showing them, and eventually they understand." That evening, as the sun set over Copper Hollow and the workers headed home for the night, Elspeth called Patience to the porch of the pale brick house. Cinder was lying in his usual spot, old and gray and peaceful. His tail thumped weakly when he saw them coming, but he didn't try to rise. He had stopped making that effort months ago. Elspeth sat down on the porch steps. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn thin from years of handling. The edges were soft, the creases deep, but the writing on it was still clear. "This belonged to my husband," Elspeth said. "He drew it the day before he died. It's a map of this wash, and a note about what he saw here." She showed Patience the faded sketch, the careful handwriting, the 3 words that had guided her across 1,000 miles and 12 years of work. "He believed in you," Patience said softly, "even before you believed in yourself." "He believed in what I knew," Elspeth corrected, "in what my grandfather taught me, in what I could do if I had the chance." She folded the paper carefully and put it back in her pocket. "Someday, someone will believe in you the same way. Maybe before you're ready, maybe before you feel like you deserve it." She looked at Patience. "When that happens, don't argue with them. Don't tell them they're wrong. Just do the work. Prove them right." Patience was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and placed her hand on Elspeth's arm. "Thank you," she said, "for teaching me. Thank you for learning." The spring of 1897 brought another flood. It wasn't as dramatic as the Great Flood of '89. The water rose 4 feet, not 8. The damage was minimal, but it brought what it always brought: timber, bark, river grass, and clay, white clay. Elspeth stood on the bank as the water receded, watching the new deposits settle into place. Beside her, Tavish cataloged the timber. Jebediah directed the workers. Patience, newly trained, walked through the wash with a bucket and shovel, testing the clay quality the way she'd been taught. Everything was moving forward. Cinder had died that winter, peacefully, in his sleep, curled on the porch where he had spent so many years watching over the family. They buried him on the high bank, in a spot where the grass grew thick and the view stretched all the way down the valley. Elspeth had carved a simple marker from driftwood. Cinder, faithful friend, 1885 to 1897. She missed him. She would always miss him. But his work was done, and hers continued. That afternoon, Elspeth walked to the highest point of the bank and looked down at everything she had built. The wash stretched before her, 200 yards of pale earth that had once been the worst piece of ground in the county. The drying rack stood in neat rows, filled with bricks curing in the afternoon sun. The storage sheds held timber and bark and bundled grass. The house rose white and solid on its foundation, smoke curling from the chimney, curtains moving gently in the windows. In the yard below, Patience was showing a new worker how to test clay quality, her voice patient and confident. Tavish was examining a stack of newly dried bricks, teaching Jebediah how to listen for flaws. Elspeth thought of her grandfather, of Declan, of the long chain of knowledge stretching back through generations and forward into a future she wouldn't live to see. She had not built a dam. She had not tried to stop the water. She had not fought the flood or cursed the land or wished for something different. She had simply understood something that took most people a lifetime to learn, if they learned it at all. Sometimes the thing that drives everyone else away is the thing that brings everything you need. Knowledge was like that too. It moved like water through a wash. You couldn't hold it in one place. You could only receive it, shape it, and let it pass on. In 1952, researchers from the University of Montana came to Copper Hollow. They were studying historical building techniques, documenting the methods used by frontier settlers to construct homes and businesses that had survived decades of use. They had heard about the Brennan bricks. They had seen them on buildings throughout the region, pale and clean and uncracked after 60 years. They found Patience Cobb, 80 years old now, living in a rest home in Helena. She was the last person alive who had learned directly from Elspeth Brennan. She told them everything, about the wash and the floods and the white clay, about the wooden molds that had come from Scotland, about the old man named Angus MacLeod who had taught his granddaughter to read earth the way other people read books, about the widow who had come to Montana with a 7-year-old son and a gray dog and nothing else, and had built something that lasted. The researchers tested samples from Brennan brick buildings across 5 counties. They analyzed the clay composition, the firing temperature, the mineral content. They compared it to modern fire brick and found it performed nearly as well, despite being made with nothing but hand tools and sunlight and knowledge passed down through generations. Their report concluded, the Brennan white clay bricks represent a remarkable example of traditional knowledge applied with scientific precision. The techniques used were not primitive or accidental, but reflected a deep understanding of material properties that modern engineering has only recently begun to quantify. Today, the wash that Elspeth claimed in 1885 is marked by a small historical plaque. It reads, Site of the Brennan Brick Works, 1886 to 1923. Founded by Elspeth Brennan, who saw value where others saw only waste. Her white clay bricks can still be found on historic buildings throughout Montana, a testament to the power of patience, observation, and knowledge passed from generation to generation. The cabin on the high bank is gone now, lost to time and weather, and the endless cycles of flood and drought that shape all things in the valley. But the bricks remain. They remain in the foundations of courthouses and the walls of churches and the chimneys of homes where families have lived for 100 years. They remain pale and solid and unchanged, keeping their color, holding their shape, doing what they were made to do. And if you pick one up and tap it against another, it still rings with that clean, sharp sound. The sound of density, the sound of strength, the sound of something built to last. If you found yourself moved by Elspeth's story, by her patience and her courage, and her refusal to give up, I invite you to like and subscribe. There are more stories like this one, stories of ordinary people who saw what others missed and built something extraordinary. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the thing everyone else rejects is exactly what you need.